Hey, my name is Aron Chang. I'm a visiting scholar with the Taylor Center this year, and also a faculty member at the Tulane School of Architecture, where I'm teaching 2 courses on living with water and community-based infrastructure planning and design. I'm really happy to be here with this panel today, and we structured the panel to be a little bit different. It's meant to be hands-on and interactive, and about 20-30 minutes in, we're going to ask every single person to get up and go to a table or to the tabletop activity outside, and then we're going to reconvene at the inn and share the results of our discussions and activities. So we've heard from some really wonderful panelists this morning about community-based efforts, environmental justice, and inclusion, and I want to just briefly connect the topic of water to climate change. Water, obviously, we live here in the Mississippi River Delta. When thinking about urban stormwater alone, we spend, the Sewage and Water Board budget is over $50 million a year, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of money to create fresh drinking water, and also to move fresh water in the form of rainfall up and out of the city when it rains. So I believe the Sewage and Water Board is the largest carbon emitter in the city, and that has a huge impact. So Tulane, the topic today is living with water, Tulane's place in the watershed. And when we talk about place, we're talking about both the geographic location, but also our place in terms of research agendas, human behaviors, as one of the largest employers in the region, and also the ways in which Tulane students, faculty, and staff and administration shape civic priorities because of the weight that Tulane holds as an institution. So our format, we're going to jump into a short presentation by John Kleinschmidt. He's an architect at Waggonner and Ball, and he's also an artist who's been engaging the issue of water through a planning and design lens, but also through an artistic lens for as long as he's lived here in New Orleans. And he'll be sharing a little bit of the work and the research that Waggonner and Ball has been doing on the campus stormwater management plan. After his presentation, we'll have 3 quick responses. Professor Jeremy Jernegan is an Associate Dean of Finance and Planning at the School of Liberal Arts, and also Professor of Ceramics. And he's going to share a few images of his work as an artist in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, often with water as a core theme. Dr. Tiong is a public health microbiologist, and his research is at the intersection of molecular microbial ecology, water quality, and human environmental health. Wendy Hills is a university architect, and her background is in historic preservation as well as architecture. And before she came here, she was at UNC Chapel Hill as a campus historic preservation architect and the former executive director of preservation in Durham. And in her capacity as a university architect, she's also the client for the city, for the stormwater management plan that Waggonner and Ball is working on. Okay, so with that, we'll jump into John's presentation. And really take in all this, each of the panelists will only have, after John's presentation, only 5 minutes to speak. And so everything that they're proposing is meant to be a provocation for each of you as you go to your tabletop activities. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Aron. I'm John Kleinschmidt. As Aron said, I'm a designer architect at a local firm called Waggonner and Ball Architecture and Environment. And I'm also an artist dealing with water. I just started a residency at a studio in the woods, this really wonderful artist residency that's part of the equally wonderful interdisciplinary Bywater Institute here at Tulane, so I'm grateful for that chance. I just moved into the woods last night, and a buzzard pooped on me while I was trying to find an owl in the forest, so I have sort of a baptismal welcome to that project. But I'm glad to be here, and I wanted to talk, just to start, oops, there we go. I think we all know this, but it's good to be reminded of the fact that we are in really a changing landscape that has constantly been changing. You can walk into a building in Rome that's older than the river in its place as we know it today. So I think that we think of the river as this young geologic thing, but it's also kind of young in human terms too. And I think just to be reminded of the constant change, and within all of that, a city exists here. When we talk about any site in New Orleans, we really have to start looking at kind of the oldest maps that exist of this city, and then start to track development over time, because the patterns of the ways that we have tried to carve out an existence in this kind of changing landscape is really an important clue to how we might continue to do that in the future. And so you can see this map on the left from 1798 shows it has formalized the connection between the high ground on the river and the Bayou St. John that kind of brings you in from the chain of estuaries from Lake Pontchartrain all the way through, and that's been formalized in a canal that previously was a portage route. And so you start to see these human paths and patterns that are laying the foundation of the city as we know it today. And later on in the 1828 map, you can see other waterways beginning to kind of take shape that are still apparent and visible, extant in the city as we know it today. And so now I try to put Tulane on the map whenever I can, and now here we are in 1849, this map that shows the extent of flooding from a really massive levee failure just upriver. And so this is constantly a pattern in New Orleans where the kind of catastrophic events reveal to us the landscape that we sometimes are able to ignore or deny by virtue of the modern day ways of urban development. And so this exposed these low-lying places in the city that had begun to be developed but were still extremely kind of precarious places to live. And this one is from 1888, and you can start to see how the city has filled in former soggy ground, really thick water rather than solid ground, I would call it. And then, of course, this very sobering image in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the federal levee failures, there's a pretty clear connection between those two images that shows us where historically people did not live and where we have chosen to develop into the 20th century. And I think we just need to keep these in mind as we look at the three lenses for us when we're doing at Waggonner Ball doing water planning and trying to increase the kind of fluency with our landscape when we're planning new projects. Topography, how high are we? The soils, which are a clue to the deep geologic past. And that's the stuff that's just constantly in motion, in flux. And of course, the way that we've found a way to kind of mediate between those two things is the modern day drainage system, which doesn't feel so modern sometimes. And why is that important? Well, it's because we, as you all know, we are within this massive system of walls that protects us from the coast, basically. And within that, we're taking on water from a lot of different directions. And we have to do this because we drain the swamp. This is literally draining the swamp, putting in a sewer system, basically, where in a place that was constantly changing, and now we've chosen to kind of freeze that in time, and we're dealing with the consequences of that. And so this is what we're left with to mediate that relationship between land and water in our city. And so over time, as we've pumped out water in soils that were formerly full of organic, well, they still are full of organic content that have slowly sunk down as we've pumped water out, the whole city has sunk, and really incredibly so. And so we're now, this is a great old map that has a section cut through from the river on the left to the lake on the right. And up above, that section is delineated, and then in red, we've gone through and figured out how has those same places moved in general. They've all sunk over time, and you can really see how dramatic that's happened between the Metairie Ridge, or the Gentilly Ridge, and the lakefront. And that corresponds precisely with those parts on the soil map that are organic content soils that have compressed and dried out as we've pumped water. And so this is the status quo. It's just totally broken. Our drainage system is consistently overwhelmed. We pump too much, paradoxically, causing us to sink more. And we have great canals. We have tons of water in the city of New Orleans, but we've buried it below ground. We've hidden it behind walls, and we've just chosen to not engage with the full totality of our landscape. And this is where, on the right, we really need to think of our city as a sponge, and hopefully this is where we're heading, to think about our cities as not these static paved places, but a place that where there is an exchange of water and land. And so this is sort of a conceptual section through roughly from, you could say, from kind of the middle of that old drawing to the lake. And so dealing with rainfall where it falls and retaining it before it hits the municipal drainage system, which we just really cannot enlarge. We're pumping about as much as we can. And we will have to rely on drainage because we do live in this walled city. But the landscape, it starts to have, it has characteristics that we don't have to look too far in the past to uncover. And so just asking ourselves, what does the landscape want to be? And we can't go back into time, but I think that there are clues as we develop in the future that we can learn from the past. And there's a canal, but then that's the improvement, you know? So when you see street repairs, just for an instant, you have a glimpse of what we might have in the city if we had open waterways. And I think that to believe that we can build streets and lay out our city just like you could in any other place is, it's foolish. And I think we think of that as coming from a place of fear, often, where we are kind of sticking our head in the sand and ignoring the risk. But I think also to believe that we can go about our business as usual without thinking about really the place that we live in is kind of, it's sort of an anemic view of life. We're denying ourselves possibilities that are embedded in this really rich and lush landscape. So why shouldn't a canal look more like that and potentially store so much more water when it rains? This is what we've agreed on as yeah, that's okay. I'll take that. You know, I don't think so. I think that we accept this, but then there are still possibilities. And of course, this takes investment. This takes effort. This takes a slow-moving bureaucracy to kind of, you know, wake up. But I think hopefully that's the kind of reality where we're living in the future. And let's go back to the campus with that in mind, as this kind of idea that we can ask more of the streets and canals and urban landscapes that we deal with every day. Let's just ask a simple question. Why does Tulane flood? Because I think that's where we're heading with these participatory exercises and events later today. And so again, the triple lens of topography, soils, and the drainage system. And you can see Tulane in the topography map on the left. We're right on the precipice of the proverbial bowl, right before it starts to really sink down into the middle of the city. And also in the soil map, we're in an interesting location where we sort of straddle right past Ferret, actually close to where we are now, I guess. We're right at that change between sandier soils that drain water and then soils that have more clay and muck that do not drain water. And so that means a lot about the way that we build the foundations of our buildings, the way we build our streets. It determines whether we sink and subside and whether our foundations will crack over time. And then in the drainage system map, zoom in here, Claiborne is the ring around the bowl of the city, and that's where all our water is heading, every raindrop that falls on Tulane. And it does that in kind of a roundabout way, depending where you are on the campus. But this is a picture of the drainage watersheds that, to the best of my knowledge, this is how it divides up on the campus. And it's not always logical, but this is what it looks like. And so any raindrop falling in any one of these spots, you can kind of track eventually where it goes, and it's all going to Claiborne eventually. And so that's where, as you know, as students and faculty here who deal with this when it rains, that's where the choke point is. And so, and you know this anecdotally, I have to look at a drawing sometimes to look at the stormwater modeling. And this is a 2-year storm, which is just under 5.5 inches in 24 hours, falling at a mathematically perfect rate, which we of course know never happens. And then the 5-year storm, 7 inches in 24 hours. And the 10-year storm, 8.5 inches in a day. And we know in between all of these, there are bizarre and unpredictable rain events that, for example, August 5th in certain parts of our city were just kind of off the charts. There's no really good way to measure that. But these are the tools that we have to kind of identify, all right, what if we dealt with something here? Will it make a difference over here? Just knowing how the system works. And so there's this incredible system of underground drainage on campus, and that, when it's doing well, it works okay. But it's not always doing well. There's soil that gets in there. You can't beat an oak tree. It's just going to have its way with whatever's in front of it. And there are different ways for this to fail. And so I think as we think of our campus as a place that is sustainable, we need to think of how do the systems that we choose to depend on, how can they be maintained? How can we uncover them a little bit so we might see what's going on in there? And the pumping infrastructure of the city it has a limit. So it's not because the pipes are too small. Yeah, there's some dirt in there. Some of those pipes are probably broken, and it's just unreasonable to expect that the city can pump more water. So within that, I think there's sort of some optimism that brings us back to our campus, and that is the tool by which we have to deal with flooding issues. And I think the great thing about a campus, it's such a special urban space. There's so much green space. There's so much potentially permeable surface that we can begin to alleviate some of that flooding if we think more creatively about our landscape. And so how much of the campus needs to be dry when we need to get around? There's probably a balance in there. We know parts of it flood that we can't deal with, but then maybe parts of the campus could flood. We start to look at, according to the Tulane University master plan, where do we need to be able to walk all the time? Sometimes. There's different depths of flooding depending on how you're getting around. And then just last week, this past weekend, in fact, this was on Saturday, Kristen Hill, a very hardworking Taylor Center fellow, took these pictures, and we accept this risk. We have signs that warn us that it's going to flood. So we're not going to solve all the flooding. We just need to be kind of aware of how to deal with it. Depending on what you're wearing on your feet, it could be okay. Other places, well, let's just keep going. Past Venice to the air mattress. Water delights, and I think we shouldn't forget that. And I'll just end with these 3 pictures. On the left, we have Gibson Hall in 1900. And so that's an image of what a campus should be at that point. And then in the middle, we have our campus present day, another view of what a campus should be. And on the right is a project by Turinscape, a Chinese landscape architecture firm, really the preeminent Asian landscape firm that's really doing amazing things and a source of constant inspiration for our office as we're working. And that's also campus. And that's actually a productive landscape where they're growing rice and just deciding to deal with the landscape in an exciting new way. And so I think all 3 are, in their time, worthwhile ways of looking at a campus. But I think that, again, if we think that the urban spaces that we deal with every day could be just like they are in any other city, then we're kind of denying ourselves these possibilities. And so that's the sort of charge I think this event is to students to think about, what could your campus be if we start to look at the whole range of the history of the land, the actual facts of the landscape, and the possibilities from both of those things. So, on.
Thanks, John. That was a great presentation. I especially love the maps. I think I can make use of them. I'm happy to be here. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be able to contribute insofar as I'm not an architect or an engineer. But as an artist, I've been engaged with water as a subject for a big part of my career. So as a way of maybe introducing myself and addressing the question that was posed to the panel of the role of what we can do in regard to reshaping the city and campus in relationship to water, I thought I'd show some images of work I've done which addresses water in a variety of ways. Going back 25 years or so to an exhibition called Marking Time. And these were sculptures that were based on a kind of inquiry into the lives of the watermen who transited the Mississippi in the 18th and 19th century. So one of the roles of art often is to tell stories and to investigate people's lives and different ways of understanding them and thinking about them. And that was of particular interest to me here. And water was a metaphor for travel and for change. This was an exhibition called Waterman's Lure. And these are glazed ceramic and steel sculptures. This is a piece called Blind Bayou. This is a kiln sculpture that was done as a project out on Horn Island off the Mississippi coast. It's called George's Oar. It's about 20 feet tall, and it's essentially a specialized kind of kiln form that at night is incandescent. So it could be viewed from the mainland when it was fired as this glowing form. This was another exhibition called Medusa's Raft. In part alluding to the famous painting by Jernegan called The Raft of the Medusa, a scene of shipwreck and despair. This is a piece from that show called Range Finding. This was a large public art work that I did with another artist, sculptor Steve Klein, that's out in front of the train station. It's called Current Watermark. And it was intended in part to orient visitors when they reached New Orleans, essentially where they were, that they were in a site based on moving water and navigational devices. There we go. This is a sculpture called Wake of the Flood that was done following Katrina as a commission. This is another kiln sculpture. This is called Red Right Returning that was installed in the lower 9th Ward in 2008. This is installing it. This was firing, and this is in the midst of the firing with some of the houses in the background. Some wall pieces. This is called Delta. Transit. Swell. This is an installation of some of that work in a show called Surge in 2006. So this is following Hurricane Katrina. I lived, my house and studio was in a neighborhood called Venetian Isles, which is in the extreme east of New Orleans, which is outside the Levee District. And it was a beautiful spot, and really, it was paradise. Still is in some ways, but it's vulnerable as hell, of course, and we were pretty much wiped out with us when the storm came through, and I wound up rebuilding, and but ultimately sold the house as flood insurance became unreasonable. This is Navigator. and I'll just read a brief statement to close. Some thoughts on this, that water again establishes the basis for these images, alluding to change, risk, and the desire we associate with it, with water. The behavior of water frustrates precise analysis, yet suggests systems that may be recognized and predicted. As an environment, water is difficult to apprehend, difficult even to see, subject to variable reflectivity and transparency. Our understanding of water is subject to external circumstances as much as to its own nature, similarly shifting our one's subjective responses to what can be an inviting or a hostile environment. I'm interested in the parallels between our perception of water and that of our own experience. This piece is called Lens. It seems we see the future principally as an extension of the past, though tempered by changing circumstances. Our relationship with water is colored by those experiences, even as we subject it to rational scrutiny. I think we continue to come to terms with the vulnerability we find ourselves in, faced with global warming and rising sea levels, internalizing both fascination and fear. The visual juxtapositions in the work reflect in part one's ability to assimilate complex stimuli and reconcile conflicting motivations. And this was the last piece in that show. It was called Prescience. And then this is a more recent work called Land Grant. I'll pass the baton now to Wendy. Are they not on there?
I'm sorry?
Is it not going there?
My slide may not have made it in there, so.
It's right here.
Oh, here we go. Okay, I have a slide. Okay. So I am the university architect. I have been here for about 15 months. Previously, I was at UNC Chapel Hill. And, you know, one of the things that I inherited when I got here was our master plan, which had just been completed. It's a 10-year look at what we're planning on building on campus. I wouldn't say that we're absolutely going to do everything that's on here, but for, you know, it was thinking about what could happen in 10 years. And part of what was driving this was the city and their new comprehensive zoning ordinance and requiring us to submit this document as a 10-year look. Part of those requirements, as part of those requirements, we also have a stormwater master plan component that we need to give the city that we're currently working on with John and his colleagues at Waggonner and Ball. And we need to provide, basically the city sees us as an institution as not providing enough detention right now for all of the impervious surfaces that we have on campus. They're requiring that we provide detention for 1.25 inches of water detention for every square foot of impervious surface. That's a building or paving parking lot that we have on campus. And so we're working with John and his colleagues on putting together this document and identifying the projects that we'll be doing on campus over a 10-year period. Part of my job is to reconcile, you know, all these great ideas that we have about what we could do with both budgets and, you know, where we're planning on doing construction projects. I mean, we could put stormwater conceivably all over campus. It really makes, we get the most bang for our buck if we do it with projects that we're already planning on building or doing. And I have a real bias for wanting to make sure that whatever stormwater decisions we make in the future, to the greatest extent possible, I want them to be green solutions, exposed, vegetated as opposed to subsurface. I want people to be aware of them. I think having them as didactic solutions where you understand your relation to water, your relation to topography, is all very important. It helps us read our landscape in a different way. And I will say that we have stormwater installed on campus right now that you're probably unaware of. You know, we do have subsurface detention right now under the LBC quad right out here in front of us. We do have subsurface detention underneath Mintz Field, which is back by the baseball stadium. We also have some rain gardens that we've installed, most recently in front of the new business school addition. Basically, depressed areas that can collect water, have plants in them that like that hydrophilic environment. And that's what we want to do more of. As I look at projects going ahead, you know, one of the biggest projects we'll have coming up in the next 5 to 10 years is our housing renewal and housing master plan. The biggest part of that is the redevelopment of Bruff Quad, which will happen after all of you graduate, so don't freak out. But, you know, the idea being that we are taking down 4 buildings on that quad, Bruff, Irby, Phelps, Patterson, and redeveloping that as a new residential quad. And what are our opportunities there to integrate water and water collection into the way you experience the place? Things that we've thrown around are, you know, above ground cisterns where you see water being collected. You're aware that there's a water tower, and that's used to flush toilets, and that's used to irrigate the ground. How can we have water detention in that base level of the building? If you have to raise your building up above the ground level 3 or 4 feet, how can you collect water right under that plinth? And what kind of landscapes do we provide on that quad to detain water? So these are the things that we're thinking through. Bruff Quad cannot be just our only solution. We have to provide solutions across campus, but we're working hard to limit the amount of paving that we have on campus, and that's a constant fight. Or constant, you know, people want places to drive and places to walk, and the cheapest thing is to pour concrete. So consistently managing this in a responsible way to have a landscape that really becomes an example for 21st century thinking about water and how you experience it. So I'm really excited to be here for these opportunities that lay ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me here. So I'm an environmental scientist and microbiologist. So I always associate water, you know, especially water quality with public health. And, you know, my research mainly focus on how to improve our understanding of the presence of contaminants, especially pathogens, and the impacts of these pathogens or disease-causing microorganisms on both human health. So, and we know that it depends on safe water for drinking, for food production, and for recreational activities. And, you know, thanks to the effective water treatment we have and protective environmental policies. But unfortunately, waterborne illnesses are still prevalent even in the United States, and it may increase because of the strain of climate change, which is a main topic today, and population growth, as well as the changing land use. And expansion of urban areas, for example, in New Orleans, also create more impervious surface area. So they collect both microbial pollutants, for example, pathogens, as well as chemical pollutants and sediments, and it can quickly transmit them to receiving water, such as here to Mississippi River, as well as to Gulf of Mexico during a storm event or rain events. So, so that's why it's important to think about water quality. So when we develop strategies to control the large amount of water we receive in the city, we also have to pay attention of you know, the strategies that we can use to improve this stormwater quality. Because this is known point sources of pollutants, and it can degrade our water quality. And for example, we can degrade the water quality in Mississippi River, which we use as a drinking water source. And it also links to waterborne diseases, and, you know, from exposure to not just drinking water, but, you know, seafood, production, for example, as well as contact recreational activities. So, yeah.
Thank you all so much. We don't have a ton of time, so we'll try to get everyone organized as quickly as possible. We have 6 tables at the back. Each of the panelists, I should have introduced at the beginning Dr. Laura Murphy from the Taylor Center, and I think at least 3 other departments has been key in organizing this panel, and also Kristen Hill, Tulane grad, and also a design fellow at the Taylor Center. So Kristen is going to be leading a table talk activity outside. It was actually developed by Tulane students at the Small Center over the summer, and it's a way in which you can, in a very hands-on way, show where flooding occurs on campus and then collectively figure out green infrastructure solutions. So I'd encourage you, if you want something super hands-on, go out with Kristen Hill. It's just out in the lobby towards the back. Otherwise, the 6 tables in the back, we'll have to crowd around a little bit. At the far back corner is art. And so Professor Jernegan will be there if you want to engage in a discussion about the relationship between art and water. Campus architecture and planning will be a table in front of that. Laura's pointing to that, and Wendy Hills will be there to engage that discussion if you want to learn more about the master plan and the stormwater management plan and what that means. To the left in the middle, towards the front, John will be there to represent design and architecture, but he also has a background in art. Behind that, Dr. Murphy will be approaching this from the social innovation angle, if you're interested in that. And then to the left, at the very far left corner, will be humanities, and I'll help organize that table. And then in front, Dr. Ah will be organizing the talk around science. And so your charge is over the next 20 minutes to talk through, if you're a student, it doesn't necessarily matter what field you're in. That may give you a better base from which to discuss, but if you're interested in discussing the arts, but you normally work in the sciences, that's fine. Go to the table, go to the panelists that most drew your interest, and then together talk about some of the resources and assets that exist here at Tulane in those departments or in that field of research. Get those. There's some large pieces of chart paper and index cards. There will be facilitators circling around to help take notes. And then at the end of the 20 minutes, we're going to come back out. One person from each table will come up and report out and share the kind of the biggest or most interesting idea that your table came up with in terms of what living with water on this campus might look like. Is it a research program? Is it a physical change to the campus? Were you inspired by the artwork and thinking about how public art could play more of a role? Or any of the other inspirations that our panelists have shared with us. So please pick a table. Don't forget the tabletop activity, and we'll meet back here in 18 minutes. All right, we're gonna get started. What is your name?
Hi, I'm Lily.
Lily is here representing the social innovation side of things.
All right, so our group was mostly made up of all students. So we talked about what are the most common issues that we see as students with water and flooding on campus. So first we talked about definitely the more common problems, which were just the overall disruption and inconvenience that it causes to students in the day-to-day. So things like you're walking to class and you get soaking wet and then you have to sit through all your classes like that, or you get caught without an umbrella, or classes get canceled and then exams get moved. So just that overall disruption of learning and daily life. And we also spoke about how it can even impact your social life or your active life. You might choose not to go to the gym because it's raining, or go to an event that you wanted to attend. So those are the more common issues that students definitely are aware of. But then a little bit less common, but still something that students are dealing with, is the potential health issue that it can that the flooding can cause. It's not as common, but there are many students at this school who have dealt with the mold either in their classrooms or in their dorms. And I know of a few people personally who had to move out of their dorms in the middle of the semester or even during finals. And not only is it disruptive, but it also is potentially a health issue and can cause asthma and other issues like that. So that's kind of what we focused on. And then what we ended our conversation with was just this idea of, if these are student problems and things that students are aware of, that the solutions to these problems should come from students themselves. And so then we spoke about how, actually in one of my classes this semester, one of the teams presented on an idea for a business opportunity at Tulane. And it was this idea, it's kind of cute, it's called Borrow-brella. But basically it's this idea that every major building on campus and every dorm would have kind of almost like a vending machine for umbrellas, and you would have a token similar to Bruff to Go, or maybe you could even just use cash and then, or swipe your splash card or something like that, and then you would always have an umbrella going to and from each building on campus, and that just would alone solve a lot of the disruptive issues and inconvenient issues that I spoke about. Okay.
Okay. So we over at the architecture table were talking about more about the 10-year plan and the future of water management on campus. We were talking about things that we'd like to see and things that are already included in the 10-year plan. So Ms. Hillis was talking about, or asking us, which areas on campus flood the most. She was kind of collecting data from us, and we were talking about how even though that space around the art center around Woldenberg floods very badly, it doesn't show up on the model. And so, and the basements of the art and of Newcomb flood pretty often, and how we'd like to see those things fixed. We were talking about things that we would like to see included in the 10-year plan, like green facades, so vertical gardens, green roofs maybe, and how we can get involved with that. Apparently they're planning to put in raised walkways on the academic quad and then leave the rest to be able to be flooding, which is pretty cool, and so kind of turning that into a more natural swampland. And essentially the idea, it looks like moving forward with the 10-year plan, is to not so much go against the natural environment, but incorporate it into the design and really have like a 21st century idea about water management and design. So.
Hi, we were in Jeremy's group, the artist. We first started talking about how people's relationship with water is somewhat hidden in the city, which was somewhat ironic. We talked about how water could be, should I speak up? We talked about how water could be displayed by so many different mediums. It could be theatrical, we could use clay, glass, pretty much anything to invoke people's imagination a little bit more. Yeah, we basically would want people to be able to look at art and then use that to spur a little bit more creativity in the sense of how we're going to move forward as a city. Yeah, do you have anything else to add to that?
Caroline?
Yeah, I'm Caroline.
So Caroline actually also mentioned at the very end the spiritual dimension of water and being able to connect specific communities with that, with how water is also a spiritual element, and use that to promote more creativity, to just allow for more awareness of the fact that we are a little bit divorced here in New Orleans from the impact that's happening on the coast.
Yeah. The clash between architecture and art and engineering is definitely where we're all going to be going forward from. So they all go hand in hand, and I really loved Jeremy's artwork. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
I think I have three more groups, so we're going to run over by 1 minute with everyone's. Yeah.
Hey, so I was in the water group, and obviously an important thing with water is drinking water, especially in New Orleans. But we started kind of talking about other uses like gray water, something that's pretty prevalent now, especially with like LEED certifications, things like that, using the vegetation and native organisms like cattails, and I think that's a Louisiana native, things like the trees that obviously transpire a lot of water. That way we can reuse that water that's not as energy intensive, so we can save some energy and use water for our buildings by kind of recycling. Another thing was improving like existing systems, so I think part of that has to do with our infrastructure. Obviously there's been a lot of water boil advisories, which happens when water stays stagnant. So how can we avoid water from staying stagnant when the pipes stop working? How do we have some sort of secondary emergency device or mechanism? But obviously that also requires energy, and that might require some new development and cost, and you might have to change the land a little bit for that. So that obviously you have to consider the pros and cons of changing the land and infrastructure there. Another thing is education and behavioral changes. So we were talking about how probably not many people know the difference between black water, gray water, brown water. I mean, I'm sure most of us have a good sense, but that's pretty important. Even if you're using your own gray water or you're doing it yourself, you should know what you can use for what, so you're not getting sick. I think that's it, right? Yeah.
So we were the humanities, and we started talking about how water is usually perceived as something to be bought, to be sold, to be consumed, to be avoided. And we were like, we should appreciate it a little bit more maybe. So then we got on this tangent of identity and historical relationships, and how do we commemorate those on campus. And we decided it would be kind of cool to have a built environment that says, this is how Tulane Universities and the students who go here, our relationship has changed and evolved with water as time has gone on. So we didn't really know what that looked like. We thought about some things that bring happiness, like fountains, think the LBC and the flowing thing. But we thought, how do we use an educational tool and bring historical relevance to this on campus?
So we're coming from the design table. And so as a group, we sort of came to the realization that water is something, especially in New Orleans, that we're better off living with rather than fighting. So we thought it would be best to use the university setting and the resources that the university has to get projects, to research projects and to implement them, in the city at large and on campus to manage water, live with it, and to make it part of the culture here a little bit more.
We have such a unique campus setting, and our place as a prestigious research institution would allow us, both as students and as professors, to take risks in design and to really become an innovating center with water management and green space incorporation.
Thanks for letting us run over. Many thanks to all the panelists for taking the time out of the day to help lead these tables. We're leading the tabletop activity 2 more times outside in the lobby. And yeah, I'm sorry we ended up with such a failure of design where you guys are all over there and I'm over here. But thank you all.